Harriet was convinced that a man of such power and influence would be able to free her.
It is a Hollywood dream more than a century before Hollywood. But it had happened to another young woman in the town, and she knew the story, and the whole town knew the story of Rose Cabarrus and how she had really managed to get her young master to fall in love with her. And he had, in fact, freed their children, and he had, in fact, freed her, and he had, in fact, even freed her mother. So there was a model for this wild alternative, and Harriet was a risk taker, and she took the risk.
Within a year of starting her relationship with Sawyer, Harriet gave birth to a son. By law, her child was owned, as she was, by Norcom. As Harriet waited for Sawyer to free them, America's Protestant churches were caught up in a sweeping religious revival. Many slaveholders saw a value in exposing their slaves to Christianity. The message from the pulpit was clear.
Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters. Obey your old master and your young master. If you disobey your earthly master, you offend your heavenly master. You must obey God's commandments.
Many African Americans, however, were extracting a very different message from the good book.
All the stories about being brought to the promised land, being saved, I mean, that had special meaning to slaves. So that the slaves drew from Christianity the parts that particularly spoke to the oppressed, the parts that said God won't forget you, the part that said it doesn't matter what people on earth think about you, I, God, love you.
On August 22, 1831, a small army of the oppressed rose up, and the world of Harriet Jacobs and of slaves throughout the South was forever changed. An enslaved preacher named Nat Turner led 70 slaves in an uprising in Southampton County, Virginia. In a 48-hour period, they killed 57 whites, including women and children.
It is no accident that Nat Turner was a preacher. It is no accident that when he goes to war, he does so based upon commandments that he finds in the Bible, in Christianity. It was disturbing, to say the least, to slaveholders that their slaves might spout back to them Christian doctrine which would justify slave rebellion.
As word of the rebellion spread across the South, whites began to lash out. In Edenton, Harriet watched in terror as every person of color became a target.
Groups of white men were rushing in every direction, wherever a colored face was to be found. Everywhere, men, women, and children were whipped till the blood stood in puddles at their feet. Mobs dragged along a number of colored people, each white man threatening instant death if they did not stop their shrieks.
And so, after Nat Turner's rebellion, lots of slaves who had nothing at all to do with the rebellion suffered. Sometimes were killed. Not because they were involved in the slave rebellion, but because white people were more afraid. And when they got more afraid, they got more violent, and they were more dangerous.
They had to retaliate. They had to show that, in fact, no black rebellion would or could succeed. And so they struck back. They killed blacks in the countryside. They took and cut off their heads, and they put them on the roadside on stands as a sign to all blacks that they could not and should not rebel.
South remained on high alert. Patrols guarded roads and gathering places. Slaveholders fostered a martial atmosphere that embraced brutality as a necessity. For Harriet Jacobs, life under Norcom's grip would become intolerable and far more complicated. At 19, she gave birth to another child by Sawyer, a daughter. Sawyer offered to buy the children. Norcom not only refused, he wanted revenge.
Norcom is threatening to send her children to a plantation of his that's known for brutalizing slaves. Harriet uses the word brutalizing, that's what we would call traumatizing. And when she speaks of what happens to people, their hearts get broken, their psyches get broken. They're not themselves afterwards.
Slowly, the realization came. If she were gone, Norcom would relinquish the children. The only way to save her children was to leave them.
And so she decides she has to act to free them. It's a wild move, but she made wild moves before.
In 1835, Harriet fled into nearby swamps until her grandmother, a free woman living in Edenton, arranged for a more permanent hideout. Soon after, Harriet was secreted away in a tiny space beneath the roof of her grandmother's house. Harriet's world would now shrink to a space 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 3 feet high.
If you take a very large library table and get under the library table, that's the kind of space that you're talking about.
Rats and mice ran over my bed. I was restless for want of air. The atmosphere was so stifled that even mosquitoes would not condescend to buzz in it. I suffered for air even more than for light.
She suffers from heat, she suffers from cold. From time to time, she can come down and walk around a little bit, but she's under house arrest, basically.
She was literally a prisoner who made herself a prisoner, and I guess that's how she did it. She survived as prisoners do.
Within weeks, Harriet learned that Sawyer had bought the children and was sending them to live at her grandmother's house. Still, Harriet continued to live a secret existence, just a floor apart from her children.
The thing that holds her back is her devotion to her children, and that was, for a lot of slave women, the thing that kept them from running away. There were a great deal more male runaways, and the typical runaway was a young male who didn't have children. For slave women, they just didn't want to run away without their children.
Days slipped into months, months into years. Harriet filled her time writing, reading, and sewing.
She describes some psychotic episodes. She talks about hearing voices, and she talks about seeing things, and she talks about passing out, and they have to bring her to.
She bore a tiny hole through one of the walls. On occasion, she could catch a glimpse of her children playing nearby, comforting herself in the knowledge that she had freed them from Norcom's hold.
Countless were the nights that I sat late at the little loophole, scarcely large enough to give me a glimpse of one twinkling star. Season after season, year after year, I peeped at my children's faces and heard their sweet voices. with a heart yearning all the while to say, "Your mother is here."
I think that her psychic strength reflects that of all slave women, because slavery demanded a different kind of womanhood. It demanded that people be self-reliant. It demanded that they try to do everything that they could to protect themselves. But she has the strength and resilience that African American women had to develop to survive slavery.
Decades before Harriet Jacobs was born, leading Southerners such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had been convinced that slavery was nearing its end. Tobacco had exhausted the soil. The need for slave labor had diminished.